Hi everybody. Welcome to week 4. We are moving along really quickly, and this week is a transition week. We move from this idea of models of federalism to really trying to get more specific, which we'll do for the rest of the course. And so this week I really want to focus on, I think, what the outcome of the changing system of federalism is, and excuse me, that outcome really reflects itself in a system of government by network. And so I want to talk about, kind of wrap up federalism a little bit in terms of what federalism has done to change our fiscal relationship between the national and state levels and local levels of government, and then move on to a specific example. So this week I gave you a somewhat longish reading. It's 2 chapters from this book by Evelyn Peterson called the Oxford Handbook of State and Local Government Finance. And it is just that, it's a handbook, kind of encyclopedic. But the reason I have you look at these 2 chapters from this text is that these 2 chapters provide a really good wrap-up of federalism and everything we've been talking about during these last 3 weeks. And so when you read that text, try starting with the second chapter, which would be chapter 3, and then move back to chapter 2. In chapter 3, here's really what I want you to be looking at in this Conlin and Posner chapter or article. Conlin and Posner go into really the history of how these models of federalism evolved from the founding of the Republic to today. And so through the 1860s, really through the Civil War, we saw this idea that federalism was dual, that each level of government, the national government and the states, had really dual sovereignty, if you will. They had spheres of influence which were jealously guarded, and really they didn't impinge upon each other that much. And this really changed with the 14th Amendment, and they stressed the importance of the 14th Amendment, which actually the 14th Amendment said that, you know, life and liberty will not be restricted at the state level, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And this really was the beginning of the era of cooperative federalism, with the expansion of federal powers and actually the expansion of state prerogatives over the next several decades, until about the 1930s and World War II forward, when this cooperative federalism actually started to favor the national government more. They mentioned that the policy agenda in the United States in the last half of the 20th century has really become more nationalized. So what we used to think of as local problems are really on the national agenda now, and I think you can see that every day. One student mentioned in one of our discussions that people seem to know more about, you know, presidential elections and national elections than they do about local elections. That is, a lot of people can name who the president is, a lot can name who their senators are. How many people can actually name their state senator, their member of city council? And so nationalization of the policy agenda occurred in the last half of the 20th century, and I want you to be looking for that and how that led to coercive federalism. And Conlin and Posner discussed this. And this coercive federalism is really a theme of what's going on in federalism today. And you see that in the news as well, with states pushing back against the national government on national policy, such as the Affordable Care Act. And we know that the Affordable Care Act has been very controversial. And one of the reasons it's been controversial is because many states have said that the national government, the federal government, does not have the authority to regulate healthcare within the states to the extent that the ACA does. And so we see this very interesting dynamic with this idea of coercive federalism. And then when you move back to chapter 2, the Kincaid article, where he discusses taxation. And of course, the power to tax is the power to destroy. That's what Alexander Hamilton said in one of the Federalist Papers. And really, I would paraphrase that as the power to tax is the power to control the agenda. And so, just like with dual federalism, taxation really, through most of, or at least half of the existence of the United States, was really a right that was exercised at the state level. The states really had almost unlimited power to tax their citizens and use a variety of innovative ways to impose taxes on people. And the federal government, on the other hand, really was limited constitutionally by the kinds of taxation it could impose. So what we saw through the 16th Amendment in 1913, which authorized a national income tax, what we saw was a federal government tax base that was relied almost exclusively on commerce taxes. So tariffs and duties on imports and excises on what am I trying to say? I'm sorry, it's kind of late. Excises on products that were made in the United States. For example, if you ever saw the Ken Burns special on Prohibition, one of the points that Ken Burns makes with the Prohibition series is that the national government really had zero interest in establishing prohibition because there was a lot of tax that was drawn from the excise on whiskey, on the production of whiskey and the sale of whiskey. And so the federal government made quite a bit of its tax income through the introduction of the income tax from excises and tariffs and duties. But this all changed with the introduction of income tax. So now we see a situation where about 45% of federal taxes are from income tax, and about another 36% are from the payroll tax, our Social Security taxes, and then corporate income taxes. And so only about 3% now, of 3 to 5% of the federal tax base is on excise. And so this situation, the original situation of taxation, has been turned completely on its head. And at the same time, we see that states, with their authority to be very innovative with their taxation structure, states present a somewhat confusing array of constitutional impositions on taxes, statutes, and limitations, especially in the last half of the 20th century. So what we end up with in our federalism in the United States is what we have come to is a national government reliant almost exclusively on income tax, and state taxation systems that rely on any number of different kinds of taxes, from property taxes, which are exercised mostly at local levels, to sales taxes, to income taxes, and to fees at the local level. So we see this play out in the way that federalism is exercised now in the 21st century. And so here's our friend here. Let's see what he has to say about intergovernmental management. And so, of course, the movie The Sixth Sense, if you saw that classic movie, you know that the Bruce Willis character actually is one of the dead people that Haley Joel Osment sees, and who doesn't realize he's dead. But the little boy in that movie sees dead people everywhere. Well, you know, intergovernmental management and intergovernmental relations are now everywhere. You can see them everywhere. You don't really have to look very hard. You don't just see them when you're sleeping. You see them all the time. So I previously talked about models of federalism, and we talked about these last week at length, and I asked you to kind of take your agency where you work and describe the model of federalism that might apply at your agency. And the reason I did that is because these models of federalism are the general case, but they don't necessarily apply across the board, and they are just models. So, for example, in the era of dual federalism, there were these separate spheres, but we saw the beginnings of innovations. So, for example, in 1862, the Transcontinental Railroad Act was signed into law by President Lincoln. And in the same era, the Morrill Act, which established the land grant college system, and the Homestead Act, which established these individual grants of land, were implemented. And so these, even though we lived in an era in the 1860s of dual federalism, these acts greatly started to change this model. The Transcontinental Railroad Act actually invented the Union Pacific Railroad, which is a Fortune 500 company. It invented the Union Pacific Railroad because the federal government assumed all the bonded indebtedness of the Union Pacific Railroad to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It also granted huge tracts of land to the railroad along the railroad right-of-way, and that land was then either used directly by the railroad in some cases, for example, to own coal rights in Wyoming, or that land was used to sell back to the state or back to citizens individually. And it gave the railroads great power, but it also enabled the building of the railroad. The Morrill Act established the land grant college system. I'm a graduate of the University of Nebraska system, which was established by the land grant college system. And it established the Homestead Act. And again, truly my ancestors were sodbusters in Nebraska. And so these acts really greatly increased the federal hold on what were states' rights, and really put a little bit of a ping in the armor of dual federalism. And then during the 1860s, we also saw the growth of commission and administration government, if you will, at the federal level. So, for example, the Interstate Commerce Commission regulating the railroads, the Food and Drug Administration with the Act of 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act. So what we see is the beginnings of intergovernmental relations from this idea that there's this dual sovereignty. And now we can see IGM and IGR virtually in everything we do in government. Social Security is a great example of intergovernmental relations through a law. A lot of people, when we mention Social Security, what they're thinking of is the original Title II of Social Security, which was the old age insurance program, which is administered by the federal government. So we all pay payroll taxes, and when we get to retirement age, we get a pension based on our high 35 years of wages. That is classic Social Security. But when the act was established in 1935, 28 states already had some kind of old age pension law. What Social Security did was consolidate these laws into one law. And so Title I was really a welfare program for old age persons, and it was means tested. That was administered by the state. Title II was the classic Social Security. Title III was unemployment insurance, and that in fact was the beginnings of unemployment insurance, which is administered by the states but partially funded by the states and the federal government. And then Title IV was the original Aid for Dependent Children, administered by the states. That was known as AFDC or ADC, which is now known as TANF, Temporary Aid for Needy Families. And so we see that Social Security really was, beyond just being a federal pension system, it really was an experiment in, and actually a very successful experiment in, intergovernmental management. Okay, so I wanted to look at a little bit of a case study, and this is homeless emergency shelter grants in Omaha. And I'm going to go through a couple things, and the reason I want to do this is to point you towards your projects, your term projects, and your study of a particular intergovernmental management issue. And what your study is going to require you to do is actually do a little bit of digging, because even though we see intergovernmental management everywhere, it's actually sometimes difficult to follow the trail, to follow the breadcrumbs. So I want to present just a little bit of a case study. So this is from the City of Omaha budget. I got it right off their website there. And this shows the revenues for the 2014 budget. And so what I want you to see really, because we talked about taxation and the variety of taxations at the local and state level, and Omaha really isn't any different than a lot of cities in its tax base. In fact, it has fewer taxes than a lot of cities, but look at the Omaha revenue sources, and you can see them there: property tax, sales tax, bond sales, sewer charges, etc. And we get down to intergovernmental revenues, which I've highlighted. Now, this is 6.3% of the Omaha budget in 2014. Omaha's budget in 2014 is about $800 million, and about $50 million of that is coming from intergovernmental revenues. So what are these intergovernmental revenues? These are revenues from both the federal and the state sources. So you would think that, I talked about this emergency shelter management program. Emergency shelter grants come from the federal government. So you would think this would be part of this $50 million that the City of Omaha sees to build emergency shelters for homeless people. But that's really not the case. These revenues are revenues that are planned, these intergovernmental revenues. So for example, a big chunk of the intergovernmental revenue that I highlight here are from the state in the form of vehicle taxes and gasoline taxes. So when gasoline taxes are imposed on the amount of money you pay for gasoline per gallon, the city's getting a large chunk of that. When a vehicle is registered inside the city limits of Omaha, the county collects those taxes, which all get consolidated at state level, but then the city gets a lot of it back. So that's what those intergovernmental revenues are all about. Grants are a different feature of the relationship between the federal government often and state governments. This also is from a booklet on grant funds, which is also in the City of Omaha budget. So you can see this paragraph right here in this pamphlet. It says that grant monies financing the programs in this section are not merged into other schedules appearing in the budget document, with the exception of direct grant reimbursements to the participating city department. Therefore, grant receipts related to the programs are not reflected in schedules pertaining to the city's actual receipts of 2014 or those estimated in 2015 and 2016. So what does that say? What's that saying is that a lot of the grant money that the City of Omaha gets, you'll never see in the budget. It's in separate documents, which the last paragraph tells you are, of course, open for inspection, and they are audited documents. They're not just monopoly money, but that you won't see this money reflected in the budget for the most part. So here's some examples. Here's some 2014 grants. There's about $3.2 million worth of grants there to the City of Omaha, and they come from various sources. So scan that. The first and second column talk about what these grants are and where they come from. So you can see that the source of these grants are the state and federal government. So for example, the state government and the federal government are immensely helping the police department with different programs for anti-crime violence, arrest policies, juvenile services, just an array of grants. And again, a lot of these grants, this money you won't see in the normal budget. It's accounted for separately. And so our emergency shelter grant, which I highlight in yellow, that $354,000 is from the United States Department Housing and Urban Development. And it is specifically designed to combat homelessness. And so let's get to how the city of Omaha actually executes this grant. So sometimes you have to do a little kind of detective work to figure out where cities are using the money that they're getting in grants. So this is a screenshot from the City of Omaha Planning Department, specifically the Housing and Community Development Division. This is where these ESG grants actually find their home, and this is the division that is tasked with spending that money, if you will. And so here's a screenshot of their division. And searching around, I find they talk about the Emergency Shelter Grant under the Housing and Community Development Division website. And you can see right there in the middle paragraph, the Emergency Shelter Grant is a formula-funded program for allocating funds to eligible jurisdiction. The City of Omaha is one such jurisdiction. Its purpose is to provide funding for shelter operations, essential services, homeless prevention activities, and rehabilitation or conversion of buildings into homeless shelters. Good. So this is in a document somewhere. Well, what's that document? Well, I did a little more looking around the website, and I found that it's in the consolidated an action plan. So here we have this 5-year strategy plan right in the middle, the 2013 to 2017 consolidated plan, which is developed by the City of Omaha. Now, the interesting thing about this plan, and I'm going to get to this in just a second, is in this plan, it talks about how the city is going to expend money specifically, for example, this emergency shelter grant. But contrary to what a lot of people think about, big government, that this is done in secret without any public input, actually just the opposite is the case. So what I'd like you to do, if I have that link up there, after you view this lecture, spend some time, go to that link and look at this plan, this 2013 to 2017 consolidated plan, and look at the various agencies that are involved in actually executing this plan. There's around 40 different agencies, government, nonprofit, sometimes for-profit agencies that are involved in actually making use of this emergency shelter grant money. It actually is quite interesting. So this ESG network, like I said, it's approximately 40 agencies. It starts with the City Planning Department, the Housing and Community Development Division, as I mentioned, and then a very large player in the execution of emergency shelter grants is something called the Metro Area Continuum of Care for Homelessness. And really what this is, it's a separate nonprofit, but it's an umbrella organization of agencies, nonprofit and government agencies that actually provide services for homelessness. Some of these organizations are faith-based, some are not, but MATCH, the Metropolitan Area Continuum of Care for Homelessness, I included their website there, and you can see what they do within this network. And then finally, the last bullet there is this plan itself. So please look at that plan, about pages 1 through, about 31, I think. It's a real easy read, but what I really want you to get at is this idea that this ESG grant, which started out from the federal government at $354,000, and so let's face it, $354,000 in the federal budget scheme is not a heck of a lot of money. But what I want you to get to is the level of networking and the level of effort involved in spending this $354,000 from the federal government in the city of Omaha, and how that involves a very extensive network of agencies to make that happen. And so let's go back to these models of federalism that we talked about the last couple of weeks, right? We see that this layer cake federalism or dual federalism, it did have applicability for the first 100 years or so of the nation's existence. We certainly can see now that there's no way that we can neatly separate either the roles of the levels of government or their taxing powers, because it certainly is at least resembles this marble cape federalism where roles and responsibilities are sort of mixed together in this cooperative federalism model. And a lot of you pointed out that you might actually, in your agency, you might actually fall under this picket fence kind of competitive federalism where programs are executed by experts really at local and state levels, and experts do a lot of talking to each other, but the governments actually might be in competition, national, state, and local. And so I think it's really interesting to note the models and to see where they apply, and note that not just one model applies. And so this brings us all to your project. So this whole course really, in my mind, is leading to your project. All the readings are allowing you to really just look in depth at one example of intergovernmental management and to see how it plays out in real life. So this week, here's what I want you to provide to each other in the discussion board. Now, I actually had a question designed, based on the readings for this week, but I had a lot of feedback on the project, and it was really a lot of good feedback, a lot of questions from a lot of you on your projects, and I appreciate that. And I wanted to give you a chance now this week really to get feedback from each other. So here's what I'm asking you to do this week. Your term project proposal is or was due on the 4th of June, depending on when you're seeing this video. But what I'd like you to do in the discussion board is take your proposal and present it, not necessarily word for word from your proposal, but boil it down for everyone else and tell them what it is you're studying. And what I'd like you to do for each other, do that by Wednesday, please. And then what I'd like you all to do for each other is to provide some creative critique and feedback to each other. Don't just say, hey, that sounds like a really fun project. Try to get inside the person's proposal and maybe present some alternatives or present some critique or questions that you think might help that person, because really my goal is for each of you to have a very successful presentation. So please do that for me this week, and at the same time do that text reading that I provided for you. And I think this probably helps us really get a wrap on this idea of models of federalism and helps us to move on to more specific subject matter for the rest of the course. So thanks for your 30 minutes of attention here, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you.